Welcome back to the show. As large companies around the country threaten or actually execute politically motivated boycotts, like what's going on in Georgia right now, for instance, these companies may sometimes face a national backlash. But beyond that, these companies actually have a fiduciary responsibility to do what is in the best financial interests of their shareholders. To that end, these companies hold shareholder meetings to, in part, explain their decision-making process. The National Center for Public Policy Research's Free Enterprise Project has taken advantage of these meetings to push back directly on the CEOs of companies like Coca-Cola and Bank of America. Joining us now to give us an inside look at that process is Scott Shepard, the Deputy Director of the Free Enterprise Project. Scott, good morning.
Good morning, Sophie. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much for being here. So as I said, you guys, you have this strategy that you employ to push back on some of these companies that have gone woke recently. Explain to us a little bit how that works.
Yeah, we own, our organization owns shares in a number of the bigger and particularly the more woke these days, American corporations. And we go these days virtually, but hopefully again soon in person, to annual shareholder meetings, because shareholders, and I urge your viewers to get involved in this process if they can and if they're interested, shareholders can go to the meetings and then ask the CEO of the corporation questions about the direction of the company and decisions that the company has made and its plans for the future. And what we do, sort of taking a page out of the left's book, because we're sort of alone at these meetings and the left has 20 lunatics making their case and their opinions known. We ask questions about the worst of the woke decisions and anti-business decisions that various companies have made in the past year. Yesterday, we were at Coca-Cola and Bank of America, and we were asking the CEOs there about their appalling opposition to voter integrity in Georgia.
Sure, and out of curiosity, Scott, what sorts of responses are you getting from these CEOs who, as I mentioned, their primary responsibility is to the bottom line and to their shareholders in that financial regard?
Well, yesterday was that's a particularly good point for yesterday, because one of the CEOs we talked to was Bank of America's Brian Moynihan, who has been at the front of a charge by American corporations to try to back off of their obligations, which are obligations at law. And so pronouncements by CEOs don't make all that much difference. But trying to back off their obligations to do right by the owners of the corporations, the shareholders, and instead rhetorically to embrace stakeholder capitalism, which would mean ignoring the shareholders, the owners' interests, in doing right by all of the stakeholders, which means doing good for everybody in the world. But you can't do good for everybody in the world. And these stakeholders, led by Brian Moynihan, are pushing a set of metrics to judge how well stakeholder capitalism is going. And he's written those metrics to make sure that they all require left-wing and only left-wing movement. Right. So his personal policy preferences are built into the supposedly neutral metrics that he's pushing. And the metrics don't include anything at all about judging the actual interests and desires of stakeholders. So stakeholder capitalism for these CEOs is just a ruse and an excuse to set themselves up as unelected, unappointed Tinpot dictators of our private lives. And that's what Brian Moynihan and his crowd are trying to do.
Well, so the interesting thing there is that I didn't hear you mention any metrics that actually have to do, again, with the financial health of these corporations, which are, at the end of the day, corporations that, in theory, need and perhaps even want to make money, especially in terms of doing right by their shareholders. I mean, what sort of metrics are we looking at? How are they choosing to judge the societal good?
Yeah, well, there have been traditionally the rule in the United States, and the rule in corporation law is mostly state law in this country. And the rule in the states has been that the duties do run to the shareholders. And so there are metrics in the background that already require fidelity to the long-term health of the company, which is in the best interest of shareholders. But the new metrics that Moynihan and his friends are pushing would require companies to report on their efforts at racial and sex diversity and inclusion, which means in this context, establishing racial quotas in hiring and replacing metrics of quality and merit with the content, the color of one's skin and the content of one's undergarments as the primary features. It would require zeroing out carbon, reporting on zeroing out carbon production and emissions, which means in large part rapidly increasing costs across the board and rapidly increasing energy costs that would cripple middle America while allowing CEOs like Brian Moynihan to continue to fly around the world without any constraints, but with shareholder money paying for all of that, and with us locked at home, so the super rich get to gamble around the world without having to see us hoi polloi. Those are the metrics. Those are the standards of stakeholder capitalism. And notably, there's nothing that requires the companies to actually figure out what stakeholders want, which makes the whole thing a sham.
Wow, there's some weighty implications of everything you just said. I mean, it's all interesting to consider, especially as we sort of move into this arena of, corporations being seemingly liable for the political sort of landscape as much as politicians are these days. I mean, the companies are expected to weigh in, and they face boycotts if they don't. So what your organization does, and I've heard a little bit from your colleague Justin Danhoff on this matter, is that he thinks that the conservative approach to these issues should not be to back away from these companies, should not be to boycott them, but should be to, as you have sort of talked about a little bit, buy up stock and join these shareholder meetings and exert some pressure on these CEOs, on these boards, on these companies to do right by their entire sort of consumer base, as opposed to just the one that is being politically loudest at this moment. Talk about the philosophy of that a little bit.
Yeah, so a couple of important points there. One is that we've been doing this as an organization for quite a while, and what we've discovered is that boycotts don't really work, especially when you've got hundreds of giant companies that are pushing the hard left woke agenda. We just aren't capable in the modern world of boycotting most of American corporations, or a significant portion of them. Now, I would never, given how appallingly Disney behaves every day, for instance, I would never own Disney Plus. But, I don't have young kids in the house. If you had young kids in the house, and what is it, Frozen? Maybe that was a decade ago. But, when the kids demand, sometimes you've got to give in. And if you're on the road and you've got to buy a Coke, I know I can't get very far without a Diet Coke on the road. What we think, and these are international organizations, international corporations, so they can sell worldwide. So boycotts aren't as effective. What's effective, what the left has figured out, and we need to figure out, is it's activism that works. So if you can afford shares and you can afford, when the country opens up, to join us at these meetings, that's a great way to do it. But if you own shares but don't want to or can't go to the meetings, call investor relations. They take those calls seriously. Right. Tell them explicitly what you're sick of, and customer relations
Makes
and all of the same
things. Scott, thank you so much. Yep. These are some important points to consider. And again, that's the Free Enterprise Project. You should check them out online. It's an interesting and valuable resource. We'll be right back after a quick break with our Just the News Minute.